You hear the name Bison Dele, and you expect a tidy sports ending, a draft night, a few big seasons, a ring, and then a calm fade into retirement. But his story refuses to land that way. It plays like a late-night investigation where every fact sounds like evidence and every gap feels louder than the headlines. Here is the first hard point that pulls this out of rumor and into record. On Saturday, July 6, 2002, Bison Dele left Tahiti on a catamaran. Public timelines identify the boat as Hakuna Matata. 4 people were reported to be aboard: Bison Dele, his girlfriend Serena Carlin, a French skipper named Bertrand Saldo, and Bison's older brother, known publicly as Miles Dabord. 4 names, 1 boat, a wide ocean that offers no witnesses. Then the second hard point arrives, and the tone changes instantly. Public accounts widely report the last known satellite phone contact tied to Bison Dele on July 8, 2002, 2 days after departure. After that, the line goes quiet. Not a rumor, not a hunch. A date. A last contact that becomes a timestamp in the middle of the Pacific. And then comes the detail that makes people sit up straight. Around July 20, 2002, the boat is reported to have returned to Tahiti with Miles Dabord alone. No Bison, no Serena, no Bertrand. Just one man and a vessel that now feels like a question you can touch. From that moment, this stops being about basketball. It becomes about what happens when the only person who comes back is also the only person who can tell the story. It becomes about how investigators read behavior when the ocean refuses to cooperate. And it becomes about the uncomfortable idea that the most important part of the case lives in a narrow window of days between July 6th and July 8th, when the last contact was still possible. Before we follow the boat, we have to understand the man, because Bison Dele did not live like someone who wanted a predictable ending. He changed his name. He walked away from the league while major coverage later described a fortune still on the table. He chased a life that felt bigger than a scoreboard. That pattern matters, because patterns are the closest thing to truth you have when direct answers disappear. So here is the question that starts the whole investigation. How does an NBA champion leave Tahiti with 3 other people and return with none of them beside him? To get there, we have to rewind past the ocean, past the headlines, and back to the beginning. Back to when he was not Bison Dele at all, but a young big man with a different name, a different plan, and a draft number that came with a spotlight. Before the mystery, before the boat, and before the world attached a legend to him, he was Brian Williams. The record begins in a place every NBA story begins: the draft. In 1991, Brian Williams was selected in the first round, 10th overall. That number is not decoration. A top 10 pick is a promise the league makes in public. It says, this player matters. This player will be watched. But not every top 10 pick becomes an instant star. Some careers begin with a different kind of pressure, the slow pressure of being evaluated every night by people who want simple answers. In the early 1990s, the league was rougher in the paint, harder on young big men, and less patient with anyone who did not fit the cleanest storyline. A young center could be treated as a project one week and as a problem the next. Public career summaries place his early NBA start with Orlando and later years across multiple teams. The details of minutes and roles shift over time, but the emotional truth stays consistent. When a player is moved through different environments, he learns something most fans never consider. He learns that the league can shape your identity before you get the chance to shape it yourself. That matters because the later version of this man was obsessed with ownership. Not ownership of possessions, but ownership of his own name, his own choices, his own direction. And you can see the early seeds of that in the way his path never fully settled into the usual template. Public biographies note that he played college basketball at Maryland and later at Arizona, a route that already suggests someone willing to change environments rather than accept a bad fit. Now, do not mistake change for chaos. Some people move because they are lost. Others move because they are determined. And Brian Williams always gave off the impression, in many public profiles, of a person who did not chase the standard version of success. That is not a claim of wrongdoing. It is a description that shows up repeatedly. The sense that he was not content being a piece in someone else's machine. That is the key to this chapter. Not that he was destined for tragedy, but that he was willing to break a script. And once you understand that, you can understand why the later choices did not come out of nowhere. They were the next step in a long argument between a man and the life everyone assumed he should want. So the question becomes simple and dangerous. When a player begins his career feeling like the league is writing his story, does he spend his life trying to earn approval, or does he spend his life looking for the exit? The next years answer that question, not with speeches, but with movement. Team changes, role changes, and a growing sense that he was never fully at ease inside the world that made him famous. A draft number can lift you up, but it can also trap you. 10 overall means expectations are always in the room. It means every coach wants you to become something quickly. It means every front office wants a return on investment. And it means the media likes to tell a simple story. Either you are rising or you are failing. Brian Williams entered a league that was not built to hold your hand. In that era, a big man was expected to be physical, reliable, and emotionally steady. If you were not, you became a question mark. And a question mark follows you from city to city, from coach to coach, from role to role. Public summaries show that his early NBA years did not immediately turn into a superstar arc. Instead, they turned into the kind of career that forces a person to adapt. One season, you are a developing talent. The next, you are a role player. The next, you are a piece that can be moved. And once you are moved enough times, you start to feel the difference between being valued and being understood. That distinction matters because people who feel misunderstood often chase control in ways the outside world does not anticipate. They control their routine, their circle, and eventually their identity. That is where this story begins to lean towards something deeper than basketball. It is not just about what he scored, but about what he refused to become. In many public retellings, Bison Dele was described as unusual, independent, and resistant to the usual celebrity chase. Those descriptions are often repeated in profiles, especially after the disappearance, as if the media was trying to find a single word that could explain why a champion might later walk away. But you do not get to that decision in one day. You get there over years, through a steady accumulation of small pressures. Think about the daily reality of a player in that position. You prepare, you play, and you still feel replaceable. You are watched constantly, yet you can still feel invisible. You are expected to make the right move, yet you might not feel like you are living the right life. For some people, that tension creates obsession with proving themselves. For others, it creates a different ambition, to disappear from the scoreboard and reappear as a person on their own terms. That is why this chapter matters for the investigation later. When a person chooses privacy and autonomy again and again, they also step away from protective structures. They become harder to locate, harder to monitor, and more dependent on a small inner circle. That is not a moral judgment. It is a practical fact. And here is the hook that carries us into the next phase. The league did not give him one stable home early on, but it did give him something else. It gave him the experience of being moved, shaped, and measured. And the more that happens, the more some people dream of a life no one else can trade. Next, the story shifts into the wandering years, the time when he became a traveler inside the league itself. Denver, Los Angeles, different systems, different expectations. And one growing question: was he building toward success or building toward escape? By the middle of the 1990s, Brian Williams had learned a lesson most fans never see. It is one thing to be talented. It is another thing to be placed. In the NBA, placement can feel like fate. One front office wants you to start. Another wants you to be depth. One coach wants you to play through contact. Another wants you to run the floor. The player becomes a moving part, and after enough movement, you start to wonder who you are when the jersey changes. Public career records and biographies show him moving through multiple teams during this stretch, including stops that placed him in different basketball cultures. The specific cities matter, but the pattern matters more. He was not living a franchise star life. He was living the life of a valuable piece that could be repositioned. That constant reset does something to a person. It can make you grateful, or it can make you hungry, or it can make you detached. And in many public profiles later, he was framed as someone who did not chase the typical NBA lifestyle. Again, that is not a claim of wrongdoing. It is a recurring description, a way writers tried to capture the feeling that he was different. Different how? Different in the sense that he seemed drawn to independence. Different in the sense that he was not satisfied being defined by the league's labels. If you are the 10th pick and you are still being moved, you start asking hard questions. Is the league judging your talent or judging your personality? Is it measuring your game or measuring your obedience? This is where the story gains its investigative mood. Because when people vanish later, investigators often look backward for patterns of relationship and behavior. They look for signs of conflict, signs of control, signs of restlessness. In Brian Williams's case, the restlessness is visible in the way his career did not settle early into one stable identity. And that sets up the crucial irony. The wandering years lead him toward the most intense environment in the league. Not a quiet rebuilding team, not a low-pressure market. The Chicago Bulls at the height of a championship machine. If any place could make a player feel secure, it would be there, right? Or it could do the opposite. It could show him the dark side of glory. It could show him that winning does not always equal freedom. It could show him that even the highest success can still feel like someone else's story. So this chapter ends with a question that is also a warning. If a man already feels restless in ordinary situations, what happens when you put him in the brightest spotlight on earth, in a dynasty that demands perfection? Because next, he reaches the center of the NBA universe, tastes the loudest success the league can offer, and then makes choices that look, in hindsight, like a door opening toward a different life entirely. In Chicago, the air is different. A dynasty is not just a team that wins. It is a system that consumes. It consumes time, attention, energy, and identity. Every practice feels like a test. Every night feels like a statement. And every player, star, or role is expected to fit the machine. Brian Williams entered that environment and in 1997 became an NBA champion with the Chicago Bulls. That fact is fixed in public record. A ring is not a rumor. It is a timestamp in history, proof that he reached the top of the sport. But here is the twist that makes this story so unsettling. Winning can be loud and beautiful on television, while privately it can raise a question that scares people. If you achieve the ultimate goal and still feel out of place, what does that say about what you are chasing? Inside a championship machine, the supporting pieces carry pressure without receiving the same kind of glory. You are expected to do your job perfectly, then vanish behind the spotlight. For many players, that is fine. They love the structure. They love the shared mission. But for someone with a strong need for self-definition, that environment can feel like a mask you never asked to wear. This is where the narrative shifts from sports to identity. In later public profiles, his name change is described as meaningful, tied to heritage and self-definition. That desire does not appear from nowhere. It grows in environments where you feel like a role instead of a person. And Chicago is the ultimate environment for that kind of pressure. The standards are ruthless. The attention is constant. The expectations do not relax when you are tired. they rise. The machine keeps moving, and if you cannot breathe inside it, you begin to dream of a world where no one can measure you by a stat line. So even as the ring sits on his record, the emotional truth may have been more complicated. A ring can be a reward, but it can also be a mirror. It can show you what you are willing to do and what you are no longer willing to do. That is why this chapter is not a celebration. It is a hinge. Because immediately after tasting that level of success, his story moves toward a new phase: Detroit, money, expectations, and the kind of opportunity that should have made him stay in the league for years. But in this story, bigger opportunity does not lead to deeper commitment. It leads toward something else, toward a rocky choice, toward a break with the life everyone assumed he would want. Next, the numbers get heavier. The money becomes part of the narrative, and the world begins to realize that this champion might not be chasing the same finish line as everyone else. Detroit should have been stability, a new chapter where a champion settles into a bigger role and builds a long, profitable run. That is the normal NBA arc: win, get paid, stay visible, protect your future. In most stories, the audience relaxes here because the direction is predictable, but Brian Williams's life was never predictable. And by the time the story reaches Detroit, you can feel the tension between what the world expects and what he seems to want. Major media coverage later described that when he eventually stepped away from the NBA, he left behind a massive amount of money that was still available to him, often framed as over $30 million. We treat that carefully as a reported figure from widely circulated coverage, not as a dramatic invention. Because even as a reported claim, it lands like an exhibit. It is the kind of number that makes people stop and ask the only question that matters: why would someone walk away from that? This is where the story becomes bigger than sports. Money is not only money, it is security, it is power, it is the ability to protect yourself. So when a person rejects it, the audience does not only feel surprise, they feel suspicion. They look for hidden reasons. Some accounts framed his exit as exhaustion with the league's lifestyle. Others framed it as a philosophical break, a refusal to live a life that felt artificial. We do not declare a motive as fact. We present what has been discussed publicly, and we ask the question that keeps the viewer watching. If this was a choice for freedom, what did he believe he was escaping? Detroit also sharpens another thread that becomes critical later: family. When money and independence enter the picture, relationships change. Influence becomes a battleground. And in public accounts of the later case, serious tension between Bison Dele and his older brother is described repeatedly. We stay disciplined with wording because this is an investigation tone, not a verdict. Still, the pattern matters. When a person is pulling away from a system and rewriting identity, the people closest to them either support that transformation or resist it. So Detroit becomes a pressure chamber. Big expectations on the outside, big internal questions on the inside, and a circle of relationships where control might have mattered more than anyone realized at the time. This chapter ends with a bridge that feels like a declaration. Soon he does something that signals he is not simply changing teams. He is changing himself. He changes his name. And once that happens, the audience can no longer pretend this is a normal sports life. It becomes a story about identity, independence, and the dangers that can appear when a man tries to step outside every system that once kept him visible. When Brian Williams became Bison Dele, it landed like more than a headline. It felt like a signal. In professional sports, your name is tied to contracts, records, endorsements, and a public identity that can follow you for life. Changing it is not casual. It is a statement that says, I will not be defined only by what you expected me to be. Public biographies and long-form profiles describe the name change as meaningful, tied to personal identity and heritage. The exact reasoning has been discussed in interviews and media segments over the years, and the consistent theme is control. Not control over opponents, but control over self. By this point in the timeline, the pattern is clear. He entered as a top 10 pick in 1991. He lived through the traveler years, the constant resets that teach you how little a player controls. He tasted the ultimate team success with Chicago in 1997. He then moved into the Detroit phase, where big expectations and big money circled around him. And instead of settling into the role the world wanted, he made a move that reshaped the story people would tell about him. Here is why this matters for the later investigation. A person who changes his name is not necessarily running from anything, but a person who changes his name walks away from the league while reported millions were still available, and then chooses a private life is telling you something about his inner compass. He is drawn to autonomy. He is drawn to a life where nobody can trade him, label him, or reduce him to a piece of a machine. And that draw can be inspiring. It can also be risky, because public fame comes with unintended protection. There is always someone watching. There is always a reason for a reporter to ask where you are. There is always a web of people who notice when you disappear. When you step away from that web, the circle around you becomes smaller. And a smaller circle can be warm, but it can also be dangerous if there is tension inside it. That is why this chapter ends with a question, not a conclusion. If he was willing to reinvent himself in public, what else was he willing to abandon in private? Because the next step was even more shocking than the name change. He walked away from the NBA path while the world still assumed he would want more. And once he did that, the story moved away from arenas and into open water, where control is an illusion and consequences can be permanent. Fans can accept almost anything in sports except one thing: a player leaving while there is still money and opportunity waiting. Injuries make sense, trades make sense, decline makes sense. But a deliberate exit while you can still play, while the league can still pay, feels like a door slamming in the face of everything the system values. In major coverage after the disappearance, his departure is often framed alongside a reported figure, more than $30 million still available when he stepped away. We treat that as widely cited reporting, not as a slogan, because the power of the story comes from the contrast. The league offers security. He chooses freedom. Public profiles suggest he wanted a different life, a life where time was his, where the day was not owned by practice schedules and cameras. Some accounts describe him as someone searching for meaning beyond fame, someone who did not treat celebrity as the ultimate prize. Again, we do not declare motive as a fixed fact. We present what has been described and we focus on what is undeniable. He made choices that prioritized autonomy. That choice created a new reality. He became less visible. He became harder to track. He became dependent on a smaller circle. And when a story later turns into a case, investigators always ask the same practical question: who was closest to the person when the wider world stopped watching? That is where the family thread becomes unavoidable. Public accounts described serious tension between Bison Dele and his older brother, Miles DeBoard. Even if you treat that as reported conflict rather than proven motive, it still matters. Because tension plus isolation is risk, and Bison Dele was building a life that included more isolation. In the end, the exit from the NBA is not only a sports decision, it is a shift in safety. It is a shift in who notices you. It is a shift in the kind of trouble that can reach you. So the exit becomes the bridge into the darker chapters. Not because leaving basketball causes a tragedy, but because leaving the system removes layers of protection. It changes the environment where conflict happens. And soon, the environment becomes literal. A catamaran in the Pacific. A voyage starting in Tahiti on July 6, 2002. A last known contact on July 8th. A return with one person around July 20th. The next chapter is where the brother steps fully into the center of the story, not as a side character, but as the one person who comes back when three others do not. In every unresolved case, there is a moment when the supporting cast stops being background and becomes gravity. In this story, the gravitational figure is Miles Dele, Bison Dele's older brother. Public timelines identify Miles Dele as the man who returned to Tahiti alone on the catamaran around July 20th, 2002. That single fact is enough to make him central. If 4 people leave and only 1 returns, the returning person becomes the main narrative source, the main witness, and the main focus of suspicion or scrutiny. But the brother is not only central because of the return, he is central because of what public accounts described about the relationship. Various retellings point to serious tension between the brothers, described as long-running and intense. We handle that with care. Reports described tension. Public accounts suggested conflict. That is the lane we stay in. Still, the pattern matters because investigators always pay attention to relationships that were already strained before a crisis. Money can intensify everything. Control can intensify everything. And Bison Dele's life after the NBA was built around independence, which can feel like a threat to someone who wants influence. The story also carries another uncomfortable truth. When you travel privately, your world becomes small. The people on the trip are not random. They are chosen. And in the final trip, public records and summaries consistently list the same group: Bison Dele, Serena Carlan, Bertrand Saldo, and Miles Dele. That group raises a question that does not go away. If there was tension, why was the brother there? Was it reconciliation? Was it convenience? Was it a family tie that never fully breaks even when it should? This chapter is not about declaring a villain. It is about setting the stakes, because once we move into the voyage itself, the brother will be the only person left to tell the story, and the world will have to decide whether that story fits the facts. Next, we step away from psychology and into the timeline of the trip, where dates become evidence and silence becomes the loudest clue of all. After leaving the League, Bison Dele moved toward a life defined by travel and personal freedom. Public profiles describe him pursuing interests beyond basketball and living in a way that made him less visible to the daily sports world. That shift is central to the case because visibility is a form of protection. When you are a headline athlete, the world notices when you disappear. When you are private, the world can go days without realizing something is wrong. By 2002, public timelines place him in French Polynesia, with Tahiti becoming the point where the final journey begins. This is not a vague travel rumor. It is a geographic anchor in the public record of the case. The appeal of this life is obvious. No season calendar, no daily cameras, no constant demand to perform. For a man who had already changed his name and stepped away from a reported fortune in media coverage, it fits a consistent pattern. He wanted a life that belonged to him. But freedom has a price. The more private your life becomes, the more it is shaped by a small circle. And in this story, that circle includes the same names that will later become inseparable from the investigation. This chapter is about mood as much as fact. The ocean is not just water, it is isolation, it is distance. It is the kind of environment where conflicts have nowhere to go, and where accidents have fewer chances to be corrected. So when Bison Dele chooses a voyage, it is not a casual vacation in the context of the later case. It is the moment he steps into a setting where the outside world cannot easily reach him. And the next chapter locks the story into the list that starts every serious investigation: who was on board, what day they left, and what day the world stopped hearing from them. Every serious case begins with a list: names, dates, places, the kind of details that do not care about emotion. In this story, The list begins on Saturday, July 6, 2002, when Bison Dele left Tahiti on a catamaran publicly identified as Hakuna Matata. Public timelines report 4 people aboard: Bison Dele, his girlfriend, Serena Carlin, a French skipper named Bertrand Saldo, and his older brother, Miles de Board. 4 people in a small environment with an endless ocean surrounding them. The boat's name sounds harmless, almost like a joke, but once you know what happens next, it becomes eerie. A trip that begins like an escape becomes the setting for a disappearance that never received a clean ending. This chapter matters because each name is a relationship. Bison Dele is not traveling with strangers. He is traveling with someone he loves, someone hired to navigate, and someone tied to him by family. That mix can create closeness, but it can also create friction. Public accounts also widely report the last known satellite phone contact tied to Bison Dele on July 8, 2002. That date matters because it narrows the window. It tells us the story had a point when communication was still possible, and then it stopped. From an investigative standpoint, that silence becomes the loudest clue. It raises questions. Did the situation change suddenly? Did conflict escalate? Did something happen that made further contact impossible? The ocean does not answer those questions, it only holds them. And the next chapter brings the detail that turns a mystery into a case. The boat comes back, and only one person steps off with a story. Around July 20th, 2002, the catamaran is reported to have returned to Tahiti with Miles de Board alone. That is the moment the world begins to panic because the math does not work. 4 left, 1 returned. Next, we enter the return, the first alarm, and the beginning of an investigation that would shift from a sports headline to an international case file. In many stories, panic arrives with sirens. In this story, it arrives with a boat. Around July 20th, 2002, public reporting places the catamaran back in Tahiti with Miles de Board alone. No Bison Dele, no Serena Carlin, no Bertrand Saldo. 1 person on the vessel and 3 people missing from the world. That fact alone changes everything. It forces the simplest and most brutal question: what happened to the other 3? It also forces a second question, one that investigators always ask when the environment was isolated. If an accident happened, what kind of accident could take 3 people and leave 1? If a conflict happened, why does only 1 person remain to describe it? If something was planned, what actions followed that suggest control? This is where the public timeline tightens into a chain. Departure from Tahiti on July 6th. Last known satellite phone contact on July 8th. Return around July 20th. A silence that stretches through the most critical days. And this is where a case begins to form around behavior. The ocean can erase physical evidence, but behavior after the fact can create new evidence on land. What calls were made? What authorities were contacted? What documents were used? What purchases happened? What travel followed? Public accounts describe authorities becoming involved and the boat itself becoming a focus of examination. That is the procedural shift from mystery to investigation. This chapter ends with a cliffhanger tied to something mature audiences recognize instantly: paper and money. Because in many cases, the fastest way to understand what happened is not to chase feelings, but to follow financial actions. And in this story, public reporting would later describe exactly that. Documents, identity use allegations, and a large gold purchase figure. Next, we follow the money and the paperwork, the moves that made investigators and reporters treat the situation as more than a tragic accident on the water. Once the boat returned with only 1 person, the case stopped being only about the sea. It became about land, paperwork, and decisions that can be traced. Public accounts describe allegations that Miles de Board used Bison Dele's identity and documents after the disappearance, including claims involving forged signatures. That kind of allegation matters because it is not an emotional interpretation. It is a claim tied to records and actions that can be checked. Then comes the figure that keeps repeating in public retellings because it sounds like a receipt read into evidence. A gold purchase described around $152,000. A specific number, a specific asset, and a specific kind of move that does not fit the behavior most people expect after a tragedy. This does not automatically prove a motive. But it creates a powerful question. If the story was an accident, why do actions afterward look like a person managing assets and distance? Why use documents that belong to someone who is missing? Why convert value into something portable? These are the questions investigators and reporters focus on because the ocean hides so much. On land, paper speaks. Public timelines also describe movement across locations after the return, including Mexico and the border area, which adds another layer of suspicion in the eyes of many observers. Movement can be innocent. It can also be a sign of urgency. It depends on the context, and in this context, the movement sits beside identity allegations and financial actions. This is why the case feels like it shifts from mysterious to sharp. When a person is missing, you can imagine an accident. When that person's identity is reportedly used afterward, the imagination changes. Next, the boat itself becomes the scene. Authorities examine it, looking for anything the ocean did not erase, anything that could confirm or challenge the only story left standing. A vessel in open water can feel like freedom, but it can also function like a locked room. When 3 people vanish from a boat and only one person returns, the boat becomes the closest thing to a witness. Public reporting describes authorities examining the catamaran after it returned to Tahiti. This is the procedural moment that makes the story feel like a real case file rather than a rumor spiral. Examinations are about consistency. They are about whether a narrative matches physical reality. We stay clear of graphic detail and focus on logic. Investigators would be looking for signs that support a severe accident, signs that suggest conflict, and signs that contradict the explanation offered by the person who returned. The ocean may remove the biggest answers, but a contained environment can still hold smaller truths, damage patterns, missing items, inconsistencies in what should be present. Public accounts and summaries often emphasize that authorities were not satisfied with the simplest explanation. Not satisfied is not the same as proven. It means the story did not close cleanly. It means questions remained. This is why the case stayed alive. With no recovered confirmation to seal the outcome, the public is left balancing the timeline, the boat, and the behavior after the return. And once that balance leans toward suspicion, the next step becomes obvious. If authorities believe a key person might disappear or hide, they move from observation to action. Next, the story becomes a trap, a reported sting operation designed to bring Miles DeBoard into custody before the case could slip beyond reach. In major cases, waiting can become dangerous. If authorities believe a key person might run, hide, or reshape evidence, they stop waiting for cooperation and start building an operation. Public timelines and reporting describe a sting operation connected to people close to Bison Dele, with a key date widely cited as September 6, 2002. That date matters because it marks the shift from suspicion to action. The location matters too. Public accounts place the custody near the border between the United States and Mexico. A border is not just a line on a map. In a case like this, it symbolizes an exit route, a place where a person can change jurisdictions and complicate the chase. Again, we keep this disciplined. Being near a border is not proof of guilt, but in the context of a missing person case with identity allegations and a reported gold purchase, it reads to many observers as a person behaving like someone who expects consequences. This is also where the story becomes painfully fragile. Once the key person is in custody, everything depends on what can be verified and what can be said. And in this case, public accounts describe hospitalization soon after, putting the investigation in a race against time. The chapter ends with a cliffhanger tied to a brutal reality. In late September 2002, widely reported as September 27th, Miles DeBoer's life ended in the hospital. With that, the case lost the one person who could have faced a long legal process and a full public accounting. Next, we confront the explanation he gave, the skepticism investigators expressed, and the way the case shifted when its central voice was gone. Once Miles DeBoer was in custody, the case entered its most delicate phase. When there are missing people and no recovered confirmation, the story often hinges on one account, the version told by the person who returned. Public summaries describe Miles DeBoer offering an explanation for what happened aboard the catamaran. Public reporting also describes investigators and authorities as skeptical, stating that the explanation did not align with key facts as they understood them. The skepticism matters because it is not driven by emotion. Investigators compare a story to timelines, actions, and the practical behavior that followed. In this case, the timeline is sharp. Departure on July 6, 2002, last known satellite phone contact on July 8th, return around July 20th. Then, according to public accounts, the sequence of identity and document allegations and the reported gold purchase figure of $152,000. Those post-return actions become the pressure points. If the event was an accident, why use documents connected to a missing person? Why take financial actions that look like asset management? These questions do not prove a motive, but they explain why skepticism grew. The hospital context adds urgency. Public accounts describe his condition deteriorating, limiting the possibility of a long interrogation, repeated cross-checking, and a full courtroom narrative that could have been tested in public. Then comes the twist that turns this into a permanently unresolved story. In late September 2002, widely reported as September 27th, his life ended in the hospital. With that, the investigation lost its central figure, and the world lost its best chance at a complete, verified sequence of events. Next, the case changes shape. Without a central voice, it becomes a file of dates, documents, and geography, with the ocean still holding the biggest answers. When the central figure in custody is no longer available to face a full legal process, an investigation changes in a single instant. It shifts from narrative to reconstruction. Public reporting widely described that Miles DeBoer's life ended in the hospital in late September 2002. That timing matters because it arrived before the world saw full courtroom unraveling. It removed the possibility of extended testimony, cross-examination, and the kind of public certainty that closes a case in the minds of viewers. For those following the story, this created the worst kind of ending, an open file. Bison Dele was a champion, tied to the Bulls title in 1997, yet his final chapter became a case defined by absence and uncertainty. The contrast between his visible sports life and his invisible ending is what keeps the story alive. Without a final testimony, the case relies on what remains: the departure date, the last contact date, the return date, the reported financial actions, and the travel points across jurisdictions. It becomes a puzzle where the key piece is missing, and every remaining piece feels heavier because it must carry more meaning. Public summaries also suggested that authorities did not expect a clean resolution after late September 2002. That does not mean the case vanished. It means it hardened into a set of public facts with contested interpretations. The media naturally filled the gaps. Labels formed, myths grew. But the reality anchors remained, the dates and the reported actions that do not behave like a tidy accident story. Next, the investigation lens moves to geography. If the ocean erased the center of the story, the edges must be rebuilt from routes, borders, and the locations that can still be traced. When certainty disappears, geography becomes evidence. In this story, public accounts described a post-return trail involving Tahiti, Mexico, and the border area. Tahiti matters because it is the point where the boat returned with only miles to board aboard around July 20th, 2002. Mexico matters because public summaries described him staying in Tijuana, and the border matters because public timelines place the custody near the United States-Mexico border on September 6, 2002. These points create a map that looks, to many observers, like movement designed for options. Movement across jurisdictions can be innocent. It can also be strategic. Context is everything, and here the context includes identity allegations and the reported gold purchase figure. Public reporting also described procedural steps like identification via fingerprints, emphasizing the institutional nature of the case once it became serious. Procedure is not drama. Procedure is the system trying to reduce a story to facts. This chapter ends by tightening the focus back to the most critical gap. Between July 6th and July 8th, Bison Dele was still reachable by satellite phone, according to public timelines. After that, silence. Then a return around July 20th with one person alone. That window is where the world still hopes the truth exists in a form that could be reconstructed. But with the ocean involved and with the central voice gone, the story becomes a legend built around a map. Next, we confront how the media shaped that legend and how competing interpretations grew around the same hard anchors. Once a case does not end in a clear legal conclusion, the public does what it always does. It turns the silence into a story. And Bison Dele's story was especially vulnerable to that transformation because it contained a dramatic mix, a champion, a name change, a reported fortune left behind, and an ocean disappearance without recovered confirmation. Media coverage often framed him with big labels: eccentric, philosophical, free-spirited, a man who rejected fame. Those labels were attempts to make the arc feel explainable. If he was always different, people think, then maybe the ending makes sense. But labels can become a trap. They can turn a person into a character rather than a human being with complex relationships. The anchors that made the story feel real never changed. 1991 10th overall pick, 1997 NBA champion, July 6th, 2002 departure, July 8th, last known satellite contact, around July 20th, return with one person, September 6th, custody. Late September 2002, the central figure's life ends in the hospital. The reported gold purchase figure of $152,000. These details gave the media a framework that felt like a script. But the gaps remained, and the gaps are where myth is born. The ocean does not provide witnesses. The case did not deliver a full courtroom narrative. So people filled the empty space with interpretations, often shaped by what they already believed about fame, freedom, money, and family. This is why the story refuses to fade. It is not only about what happened, but about how the world reacted to not knowing. The more uncertainty remained, the more the narrative became a mirror for the audience. Next, we step back from labels and lay out the competing possibilities, not as verdicts, but as explanations that people have argued over, each one tested against the same public anchors. When a case remains unresolved, the public tends to split into camps. Each camp holds a version that feels emotionally satisfying, but a responsible voiceover does something harder. It tests each possibility against the anchors that can be repeated without exaggeration. One possibility is an accident at sea. Boats fail, waves turn, chaos happens fast. This explanation remains emotionally plausible because the ocean is unforgiving and because no recovered confirmation closed the story. But the public record complicates the accident idea with what was reported afterward. identity use allegations, forged signature claims, and the gold purchase figure around $152,000. Those details do not automatically eliminate accident, but they create a question. If the event was a tragic accident, why did actions afterward look like asset management and identity control? Another possibility is conflict on the boat. Public accounts described serious tension between Bison Dele and his older brother. Isolation can magnify conflict. In a small environment surrounded by open water, there are no easy exits. If conflict escalates, consequences can become permanent. A third possibility is intention, a scenario where behavior after the return reads to observers as planning rather than confusion. Movement across jurisdictions, the reported financial actions, and the custody near a border all feed that interpretation in public discussions. None of these possibilities can deliver full closure without proof that survived a long legal process. And that is the tragedy of this case. The world lost the chance for a complete public accounting when the central figure's life ended in late September 2002. So the honest conclusion is not an answer, but a reason the story endures. The anchors are strong, the gaps are stronger. And when the gaps cannot be filled, the human mind keeps returning to the same question. What could have happened in that narrow window between the last contact on July 8th and the return around July 20th? Next, we step into the psychological core that ties the entire arc together. Why Bison Dele kept choosing freedom over comfort, and how that choice may have carried hidden risk. If you want to understand why this story still grips people, you have to understand the pattern in Bison Dele's life. He did not follow the most predictable path for a champion. He changed his name. He stepped away from the league while major coverage later described a fortune still available. He pursued a private life built around travel and autonomy. We cannot read his mind, and we should not pretend we can. But we can interpret behavior the way a careful storyteller interprets behavior. Repeated choices reveal priorities. Bison Dele's repeated priority appears to be self-definition. He did not want to be owned by a schedule, a brand, or an expectation. That is a powerful trait. It can inspire people. It can also carry risk, because the more you separate from public structures, the more your life depends on a small circle. And in the final chapters, the circle becomes painfully clear. He was not alone. He was with his girlfriend, a skipper, and his older brother. If public accounts about tension are even partly accurate, the environment was already fragile. And the environment itself, a boat in the Pacific, offers very little room for mistakes. This is the dark side of glory that few people talk about. Fame can trap you, but it can also protect you. When you step away, you gain freedom, but you also lose visibility. You become harder to reach, harder to help, harder to find. That does not mean freedom was wrong. It means freedom is not safe by default. It is a choice that changes the shape of your life. So the final question becomes more than investigative. It becomes human. If Bison Dele was chasing a life beyond the NBA machine, did he fully understand what he was trading away? Not money, not fame, but the layers of attention that might have made it harder for a story like this to unfold unseen. Next, we close the file the only way a responsible voiceover can, by laying out why it still feels unfinished, repeating the anchors that remain, and leaving the viewer with the question that still has no confirmed answer. Some sports stories end with a trophy and a retirement ceremony. This one ends with a timeline and a silence. The anchors that remain are sharp. In 1991, he enters the league as the 10th overall pick. In 1997, he becomes an NBA champion with the Chicago Bulls. Later, public coverage describes him stepping away while a fortune was still available, often framed as over $30 million. That choice alone made people lean in because it suggested he valued freedom more than comfort. Then the final timeline locks into place. Saturday, July 6, 2002. Departure from Tahiti on a catamaran publicly identified as Hakuna Matata. July 8, 2002. The last known satellite phone contact, widely reported in public summaries. Around July 20th, the return to Tahiti with Miles DeBoard alone. After that return, public accounts describe allegations involving identity and documents and a gold purchase figure around $152,000. In early September 2002, widely reported as September 6th, a sting operation leads to custody near the United States-Mexico border. And in late September 2002, widely reported as September 27th, the central figure's life ends in the hospital, removing the possibility of a full public legal unraveling. That is why the story never feels finished. The anchors are real, but the gaps remain. The ocean hid the center of the story. The legal process never delivered a final public narrative, and without recovered confirmation, the case lives in questions. So the closing question is the same one that has kept this story alive for decades. If the last known contact was July 8, 2002, and the boat returned around July 20th with only one person aboard, what happened in that narrow stretch when 3 other voices existed, and why did those voices never return? Bison Dele's life reads like a series of exits, from expectations, from celebrity, from the league, and finally from visibility itself. And the final exit is the one the world cannot fully explain. That is the final resonance, not just a mystery, but a reminder that freedom can be a beautiful choice, and that the open ocean can keep secrets that no spotlight can reach.